future of and then once we maybe spend a little bit of time, like I said, just talking about the future of analytics and some areas where I'm really passionate about, just talking how kind of the experience I think really needs to evolve to adapt to the way analytics and data in general is evolving in the market. We'll open it up to, I think Regina and I will talk through a couple other topics and then open it up to Q&A. So thank you so much, like I said, for joining. And with that, I'll dive into sharing a little bit of just kind of a perspective on the market trends that we're seeing, and I think more specifically how that is influencing how we think about the product experience that we're building at Sisu, and more generally how the product experiences for analytics products needs to evolve to cater to some of these macro changes. And so the first slide here, this is, I can imagine, not news to anyone in the audience today, but as we all know and feel, the cloud is changing the entire data analytics stack. And this is just a very simplified version of, if you kind of break down the data stack to include sources where we get the data, pipelines of how we move it into storage area warehouses to be able to analyze, and then finally that analytics or value extraction layer at the end. This is kind of, like I said, very simplified version. And if you think across each of these, we've really seen or are seeing the cloud have a massive impact in each of these four categories. So no surprises, we've moved from on-premise to cloud-based SaaS applications. We've seen just an explosion in the amount of data that companies can generate. And this comes from, so many different applications yield so many different signals, right? And so it's the volume that's growing, but also the dimensionality. There's more and more signals for any given action that a user is taking or that a business is taking. And so we're seeing that explosion in the amount of data points. And then in the kind of infrastructure to consolidate that data and get it into a place where it can be analyzed, what we've seen in the transfer of that in the data pipelines is this move from kind of traditional ETL, right, where you extract, transform, and then load. So you're actually not storing the raw data, in part because it used to be too expensive and cost prohibitive to do that, to this new trend where it's more of this kind of what we call extract, load, and then transform. So you're actually loading the raw data and keeping that for reference, and then doing any transforms you need when you need them, right? And the reason that we're able to do that is because of the emergence of cloud data warehouses and the fact that we can store more and wider data in a really cost-effective way. And so this kind of the across these three areas, the net result is, as you can imagine, not just higher volume, but higher dimensionality of data. And the observation that really Sisu was founded on, and I think where you're going to see a lot of innovation happening in this final layer, is that in order to extract the full value of this wider, fresher data, we need a new engine. This analytics layer, this value extraction layer needs to be fundamentally rewritten. And there's an opportunity to do that in a way that not only takes advantage of the increasing volume and dimensionality of data, but actually delivers a better product experience for the problem that customers actually, or that businesses actually need to solve. So that brings me to talking a little bit about, if these are kind of the macro trends and a little bit of a simplified view of, the industry and the data stack, how does that actually translate to what folks actually in roles in organizations, whether those are businesses, nonprofits, et cetera, the organizations that have all of this data, how is this manifesting for them? And the way that we talk about this at CSUN, this has kind of been informed by spending a lot of time with customers, is it's this notion of almost a last mile problem. So you can see that, and if you can see my mouse here, as I'm hovering over everything we just talked about in terms of those first three buckets is where you're seeing the net result is wider, fresher data. It's easier to capture, cheaper to store. And that's actually creating this opportunity where businesses are saying, let's invest in getting more of that wider, fresher data. But then as they move into, okay, how do we actually extract answers to the questions and insights about our business from that data? That's where we start to see challenges arise. And specifically, we're seeing that this is spread across a number of different tools, right? There's kind of this notion of static dashboards or traditional BI where you're creating a bunch of reports or visualizations, but those only go so far. And then there becomes all these follow-up questions that companies need to ask in order to actually make a decision. And that's where we're seeing a lot of people have to jump into reactive mode to try to respond to those questions as they come up, and then spend a bunch of time actually putting those together into summaries that are digestible and actionable to the business. And this is such a messy and candidly still very reactive manual process that what ends up happening is instead of making proactive data-driven decisions, oftentimes decisions have to be made just because time ran out, not because we got the full answer that we need. And to summarize a little bit more where we're seeing legacy tools really fail or unable to scale to the realities of data today, there's three buckets that we've seen. They're too slow, they're unreliable, and they're inaccessible. So specifically, what does that mean? Too slow is it's about both their ability to scale across this increasingly complex dimensional data, but it's also about how quickly can you iterate, because we know that there's multiple dimensions of questions to ask. And so we're seeing both iteration be very slow, kind of these legacy BI tools, because they're so structured around dashboards. And then, of course, actually running analysis over the complexity and dimensionality of the data, it's almost prohibitively time consuming. So oftentimes it doesn't even happen. When we talk about unreliable, it's about the breadth of questions that people are expecting to be able to ask of their data. With more data, we want to answer more questions. Simply knowing what happened to my metric is no longer sufficient. We want to be able to diagnose why it happened and to actually be able to think in a data informed way about now what should I do about it. And if all I can answer with a dashboard is what happened, you're missing all of these other questions around why it happened and being able to dig into some of that more diagnostic capabilities that people want to be able to do in order to inform decisions. And then finally, inaccessible. This is where at the end of the day, we come back to an organization's goal with data is really to make a better decision. And in order to do that, there's multiple stakeholders involved in any decision. You know, there can be people who are very close to and driving a lot of the analysis and trying to influence the decision. There can be those who are maybe not as close to the data, but need to understand it because they're part of actually signing off on the decision. So the reality is decision-making is a very multi-step, multi-user workflow. And the challenge we're seeing with legacy tools is they're really not built for broad adoption. They're not built for broad collaboration. And so you end up with these information silos, stale summaries that are not actually serving the need the ultimate goal that companies have with digging into their data and analyzing their data, which is ultimately getting to that decision. And so what does that all mean, right? This is a lot of problems, a lot of what's breaking, but what does that imply about the future of analytics? And really, this is where we would say the future of analytics is not even analytics. The future of analytics needs to become this concept of decision intelligence. The way we think about building product, using product, and leveraging technology to do data analysis needs to extend beyond just the analysis piece, or at least traditionally what we've thought of as just the analysis piece, to encompass this concept of decision intelligence. And what we mean by that is, as you can see here, kind of everything in this navy blue box is how we imagine decision intelligence will evolve in this new world of cloud data. So what that includes and how we would think about structuring decision intelligence is there does need to be this kind of underlying metric layer. And this is where the business can actually codify and capture things like which metrics matter to us. Let's define those metrics centrally and reuse that definition. Let's capture some of the business logic. This metric is important to us. These other dimensions that are also represented in the data for this metric, these are the types of dimensions that are actionable to us. So that's what we mean by a shared metric layer. And this is where data forward organizations and organizations that are able to actually be data driven in decision making, they ground everything in shared understanding and definition of the metrics that matter to their business. So that's kind of the foundational layer. In the middle here, you see these boxes around answering different types of questions, which really need to span not just the traditional what questions, which is where a lot of analytics has been focused, but also these questions around, well, why did, if a metric went up, if it went down, which is kind of a what observation, immediate thought is, well, why did that happen? Why did it go up? Why did it go down? We need to be able to diagnose that. And then now what is referring to capabilities like forecasting, predictions, scenario planning, even being able to take action and execute on that action. And I'll underline that these three categories of questions are really not linear, right? They are iterative, and a what question might prompt a why question, which prompts another what question. And so we need to think of these as a nonlinear journey. And across that nonlinear journey, there has to be, as a first order principle, collaboration. And how do we think about bringing in all the relevant parties who need to be involved in making a decision? How do we bring them into understanding the data, understanding the insights, discussing them, sharing them, and actually incorporating that multi-step iterative process in a way that matches our expectations as users today about what collaboration looks like in modern SaaS applications. So to put just a little bit more kind of finer point, because looking at an abstract diagram like this maybe is a little bit hard to say, well, tangibly, what does that actually mean about the product experience? And so this is where I want to transition into being able to share a little bit about concretely how we imagine, and this is early stage. I think there's a lot of work to do to continue to expand on what this product experience actually has to look like. But to just give a little bit of a glimpse of how we think about it at Sisu, I want to just show a couple screens here. So, as I mentioned, we do still see there's a role for dashboards, right? Dashboards help orient you to what happened and help you track some of these key metrics. And so this is a screenshot showing what that kind of dashboard might look like in this example. You've got metrics around total revenue and average order value. And you're able to come in and kind of understand some of these trends. But immediately, this prompts more questions, right? Instead of answering all your questions, you're saying, well, I see a dip, I see a spike here. Why did that happen? Why is average order value down for this particular week? Was it down for everyone, or was it only down for some segments? What should we do about it? And so this is where the ability to actually look at or hone in on a particular visualization or data point and be able to actually dynamically and in real time answer what drove that change. Click on that. And that is where in Sisu, we imagine really then kicking off what we call this more diagnostic key driver analysis, right? And so this is an example in Sisu where just clicking on that one data point, understanding I saw a dip in average order value here, we'll automatically run this comparison of, okay, well, what happened? Take that period that you clicked on, compare it to the previous period. And in real time, look at all of the different subgroups or dimensions in the data that could have influenced that change in metric performance. Pull out the ones down here under this top drivers tab, pull out the ones that with statistical significance had impact on metric performance, and then give you the ability as a user to add this commentary, right? Going in and noticing something like, it looks like our December promotion code is really losing effectiveness. We're seeing this negative impact specifically for customers who are non-loyalty members, right? It's a combination of this coupon code with loyalty program being none. That's something that actually can inform, now what do we do about it? Let's actually scale back on that promotion for that segment. Or we're seeing this particular ad not perform well on mobile specifically. So let's ramp down the use of this. And again, being able to bring in that human aspect of how do we actually comment and decide what we want to do, discuss in real time as a result of the diagnostic capability. So I'll pause there. Those are all the slides I had. I know it can be hard to just look at a talking head and slides for a while. So we'll transition into some more open dialogue, but wanted to just give a little bit of perspective on, you know, how we are thinking about the future of analytics and really of decision intelligence at Sisu, and then more concretely how that translates into the product experience we're building.
That was super interesting. Thank you, Barrett. I do have a few questions for you before I open it up. So I wanted to have you discuss a little bit about your non-traditional path into product. And I think a corollary to that is really the whole concept, which you talked about data being inherently not human-centric.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I'll start with just kind of my path into product, which was definitely, does not fit at least the quote unquote Silicon Valley model of, you know, CS background and deeply technical or, you know, engineering type background. So as I think you and Regina in my educational history is actually in studying history and economics. So very much a liberal arts education, and candidly did not know really much about the world of technology while I was kind of growing up and pursuing my undergrad degree. And I ended up actually, like I would say very by chance and serendipitously falling into technology. I was born and raised in Minnesota, joined a company that happened to be a Minnesota-based company that was growing very fast. It was an enterprise storage company called Compellent. Wonderful, wonderful company. And, you know, just happened to join it because I was from Minnesota and it was a fast growing company, and actually started in a marketing role, and was very lucky that someone on the exec team there really, who was actually in a marketing role, kind of looked at me and said, hey, I think you should do product. And I candidly didn't even know what product was. I was very lucky that they took a chance on me and were willing to give me that opportunity, but it was very much a learn on the job type of experience. And I owe a lot to, I would say, particularly the other managers on my team and the engineers who were doing a lot of coaching and helping me kind of come up to speed. And I share that because I think it's important. It's candidly something that I was reticent to share early in my career, because I kind of always trying to prove, I've got the technical chops to be here. I've got the background and prove that, and almost like hide the fact that I had come more like liberal arts and learned on the job. But as I've gotten further along in my career, I think I've come to recognize that there's actually value in having that non-traditional background. And I think it shapes how I approach product and wanting to, I almost sometimes think of building product as a little bit of, you're almost like a historian going in, although in real time, but like really trying to dig deep and understand people and specific circumstances that you're trying to build for and create frameworks around those. And all of that stuff I learned in a very liberal arts background. And so anyway, I think that's kind of been my path. And I think it's something that over time I've come to actually appreciate how it influences my approach and want to share it, because I think that sometimes we get a little bit, whether it's product or, data roles or really any role, we maybe get a little bit at times narrow in our focus or definition of what someone needs to look like or what their background needs to look like to enter that function. And I'm hopeful my example can help broaden perspective a little bit and say that there are paths into roles, be it product or any other role.
And so what about we've had some interesting discussion about the human centricity of data. And I think Sisu helps solve that problem a little bit. So I'd love for you to expand on that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one other aspect, I guess, of my journey into product is that in addition to kind of having this non-traditional path initially into product, relatively early in my career, I also had the opportunity to really learn product under the leadership and mentorship of a design leader. So this was someone who helped me see, I would say early on, a lot of my product thinking was what I would call quote unquote kind of ivory tower thinking, right? It was, way too grounded in what I thought, not in operations about what customers or users actually thought. And almost this kind of like intellectual debate where we would spend a bunch of time internal as a product team or as the company kind of saying, well, I think this, and kind of having these debates. And to me, what human-centric design thinking means at the end of the day is you take off the I think and you go and you actually really do that investigation to understand users and their mental model and what problem they're trying to solve. And it may or may not match what problem you think they want to solve. And, just can't underline enough. I've spent years building a product that was way too insular in how we were doing that and not spend enough time grounding what actual problem that matters to our customers. And that I think is a place. It's not to say that all analytics products have to do that. It's more so to say that I think when we do that, when we go and really sit down and talk to, which we've done when we sit down and talk to analysts about where do you spend your time? What happens when you get bombarded with 10 questions? Who's asking those questions? How do you respond to them? It starts to open up these different types of problem statements that maybe weren't even thought about in the in the realm of what we build in an analytics tool, right? You start to actually open up some of these things around, well, you're jumping into this tool here, and then you're jumping into Google Slides, and then you're writing an email, and then and that's actually like a lot of wasted, inefficient work. And that allows you to kind of maybe broaden. And this is, I think, some of the inspiration around saying, we're not building a tool for analysis, we're building a tool for decision making, a platform for decision making. So you can kind of, by taking that human-centric, really understanding what's your end-to-end workflow, not just how do you use fill in the blank BI tool today, but what's your end-to-end workflow, and let me observe that and let me sit and see what's painful about that. It allows us to kind of broaden, I guess, the scope of what a solution might look like.
Oh, that's really interesting. So not perhaps not an obvious segue, but something definitely we wanted to talk about a little bit on today's call is you've got some ideas about how to accelerate women in leadership roles. So I definitely wanted to capture that a little bit before I open this up for questions.
Absolutely. So I think probably one of the biggest opportunities I see, it does actually tie into what we talked about in terms of non-traditional path into product, which is whether it's any sort of underrepresented group, whether it is women, whether it is different types of educational backgrounds, different types of cultural backgrounds, different countries, things like that. I think there is an opportunity that, you know, a lot of people, there's a lot of discussion these days, right, about how do we get more of these underrepresented groups into various roles, into various industries. And I think one of the biggest untapped opportunities is to look at, well, can I maybe broaden my view of what the background needs to look like to be in this role, right? Because we know that there's going to be long-term work we need to do to get more underrepresented, take technology, right? There's going to be more long-term work we have to do to get more underrepresented groups into STEM and into some of these more traditional backgrounds that feed into industries like tech. But we can't just sit and wait for that to happen, right? Because that doesn't happen overnight. And so I think one of the most important opportunities really is saying, well, what is visible on the job, right? And how can I maybe find people who have the right attitude or have the right ambition or have the right way of thinking about a problem that's just never been applied in this context, and let me help them apply it, right? And that could mean, you know, recruiting just from the open market and saying, here's a different type of background where I know that like XYZ role has a lot of thinking and structured thinking that could be applied in this new role that I'm trying to hire for. Or it could mean transitioning someone who's already in the organization and has expressed interest in a function. They've got all the domain expertise and context, and so they actually may ramp faster than bringing, you know, a kind of traditional background in from the open market. So that's one way to kind of, I think, get some of those groups, you know, more represented into. That doesn't necessarily solve what you also asked about, which is into leadership roles, right? Because if you're making a transition into a new type of function, it's probably not going to be directly into a leadership role. And, you know, that's where I think there's, you know, there's short answer is there's no silver bullet here, right? It's just to use a phrase, there's a lot of lead bullets. And I think some of that is just talking about, you know, I personally have been really lucky in my career to work with and for a number of really strong, powerful role models who happen to be female. And I think the biggest thing that I'm grateful for in that, and the thing that I would love to try to carry forward throughout my career and as it progresses as well, is how do we, as whether it's as women or any other representative group, how do we lift each other up, right? I think there's been historically research and examples of times when instead of kind of lifting each other up, there's almost like a sharp, I need to be the woman in the room. And like I said, I've really benefited from women who did not take that view, who said, I'm actually, I think at one point had someone say to me, like, I'm excited about hiring you because of you and you're awesome and what you bring, and the fact that you're a woman makes it even better, right? And it was this kind of like the opportunity then to help elevate and give an opportunity to someone who was coming from an underrepresented group. That was something that was kind of explicitly acknowledged as, that's an exciting thing that I want to be able to do as a woman in a position of power. And so that's something that I think is incumbent upon leaders, is to seek out those opportunities to elevate and not to have that be a competitive situation, if you will.
Yeah, I concur with you wholly. And it's actually a premise of why Women in Big Data got started in the first place, was we thought, well, we'll build a community to help pull each other along, essentially. And so networking is very key. And we've instituted both technical and business skills training, because you really need both to excel in one's career. And the treatment of women really extends to minorities and every other group. So I think it's really an important cultural mandate, and also this sort of myth of scarcity at the top is something that really needs to be worked on. I concur in terms of pulling each other along and empowering each other. I completely agree, and very thrilled that that A, you had a non-traditional path, B, you've done so well, and C, you're here with us today to share all of that. So with that, I'd like to open up the session. You either can unmute yourself and ask a question, or send a question in chat. And I just want to remind everybody that this recording and a blog will be available on womeninbigdata.org in about a week or so. So any questions for Barrett on either career stuff or analytics? Oh, good, looks like somebody is connecting to audio. Naru? Okay, whoops, now Naru muted themselves. Okay, great. Catherine, go ahead, please unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hi guys, thanks so much, Barrett, for that. It was really insightful and interesting. I think, well, I can speak from my perspective that the collection of data, not the problem. I think most companies would consider themselves drowning in data. I think the second point of like identifying key metrics is something that can be fairly easily, well, in my experience at least, something that we get a common definition on fairly quickly as well, knowing what moves the business. But the later stages of like how to interpret the data and how to make it actionable remain kind of the key challenge. I see that the product you were kind of showing today is trying to address that. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about instances where you've seen those latter two stages like work well, what processes or even who is involved in that type of decision making of interpreting the data and making it actionable. Like, could you tell me a little bit about situations that you find that works really well in, and how organizations like ours could potentially replicate that success?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a great question, and one of the things I want to that you said that I think is so critical to it is there is a need to interpret, right? And there is a need to, and this is where I guess what I'm trying to say there is like, that is never going to be automated away by technology or a human, or technology or a product alone. We really think of, at the end of the day, decision making is a combination of, yes, there's a technical component, and I think there's where technology help automate some of the manual repetitive things, but it's also a process. There's also a process element and there's a human element, right? And so those three things, like, we can't forget that they need to come together. And processes can be things, I think, around what you're alluding to, which is how do we actually institute best practices around as an organization around how we have these discussions. And then the human aspect, I think, does there. Humans are the ones who have the context of what matters to the business and what's actionable. And at the end of the day, an analysis is only going to be as good as the data that you feed it, right? And the input that you put into it. And a human can maybe provide some additional context to say, well, maybe this dimension that is being surfaced is, maybe there's maybe representative of a different dimension that's not in the data. So those are some high level thoughts to just get a little bit more concrete and tangible into your question. What have I seen work well? I think one of the areas where we see customers and what's, I think, been really interesting with Sisu is I talked about how do you diagnose why, and I want to be very clear that the way that the actual Sisu product works is think of it as basically surfacing statistically significant correlations. We are not trying to answer causality. That is a very tricky, difficult, the way you're going to actually get causal conclusions, right, is actually running a true, well-run A/B experiment. And so that's an example where I would say a person who understands kind of how to think about data and how to think about interpreting that data can help contextualize in discussion with colleagues at the business. Basically what we're able to do with a tool like Sisu is we're able to say hundreds of millions or billions of different subgroups in the data that could have had impact on the metric. Technology, automating this in Sisu allows us to identify the 5 or 10 subgroups that actually are with statistical significance correlated with a change in metric performance or something. And then structure, but help people realize, like, that alone is not the answer. What that allows us to do is it allows us to focus, right? And this gets back to, Catherine, I think the first part of your question, which is the amount of data we have is not the problem. It's where do we focus? And I think there's a great quote by Herbert Simon, which is, the kind of, I'm going to get the exact quote wrong, but so in the wealth of information or data, the attention kind of focus is the scarcity, right? And how do we actually know where to focus out of all these different dimensions? That's a place where I think folks who are in, whether it's analyst roles or kind of these like decision influencers, right, who are close to the data, can help structure that conversation and say, this allows us to focus. It allows us to then, as humans, create hypotheses that we can then go test, right? Or it allows us to move forward with a more informed, less biased view of what might be influencing metric performance, because it wasn't grounded on us just manually deciding where we wanted to investigate in the data. So hopefully that gives a little bit more tangible experience. The one additional, I guess, recommendation that I'll add there is, I think, standardizing on how you report out and how you share information. I think when each new question comes with a completely new way of like visualizing and speaking about the data, that can actually create a lot of cognitive burden for those who are not as statistically inclined or as data savvy. And so if as an organization, you can find ways to work well for how you actually summarize those results and share them with each other, and not kind of reinvent the wheel with every new summary. And that's something we've also tried to do in CSU by automating things like creation of waterfall charts and being able to standardize some of those reporting out capabilities. That is another kind of, I guess, thing I've seen work well. I had actually, this is just one kind of quick anecdote. We were talking with a customer who basically said, a lot of decision makers cannot think beyond green, yellow, red. And so at some point, being able to get to that summary and bubble things up in a consistent way, I think can really help provide the frameworks for the data to actually influence decision.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Barrett.
Thank you.
So do we have any remaining questions for Barrett? We've just got a few more minutes before we wrap up today. Okay, I think Barrett, you've wowed us, and appreciate you taking the time to share your story and tell us a bit about decision making and intelligence and so forth. As I mentioned before, we'll write this up, post the video, and find us on womeninbigdata.org in about a week. And thanks everybody for taking the time to chat with us today. It was great. Everyone have a great rest of the day.
Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
All right, cool. Yeah, I like all the loves and claps and party on emojis. Keep them coming. All right, take care, everybody. Oh, and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
All righty, bye.